So imagine trying to build like a functioning, peaceful society entirely out of violent outcasts, kidnapped captives, and these blood-feuding warlords.
Right, which is already a recipe for absolute disaster.
Totally. And now imagine trying to do all of that on a freezing, completely uninhabited rock that is quite literally tearing itself in half along a tectonic fault line.
Yeah, it sounds like a fantasy novel, but it's just history.
It is, because today we are doing a deep dive into medieval Iceland. And the reason this is so exciting is because in just a few days, you, the listener, are going to be there. You're going to park your rental car, step out into that incredibly bracing North Atlantic wind, and actually walk onto the rocky plains of Þingvellir.
And that ground has so much history.
So much. The goal of our deep dive today into all these amazing sources is to really make sure that when your boots finally touch that volcanic earth, you actually feel the immense historical, geological, and honestly just deeply human weight of what happened right where you're standing.
I mean, it is arguably one of the most audacious political experiments in human history.
Yeah.
We are talking about a group of people in the late 9th century who deliberately designed a stateless society.
A stateless society, which is wild to even think about.
It really is. They established this incredibly complex system of governance to manage, well, human nature, super scarce resources, and just incredible amounts of violence. And they did it using nothing but a framework of spoken laws and privatized social contracts. No king, no executive branch, no standing military, and at least initially, no church.
Okay, let's unpack this because we have a massive stack of sources to guide us through this landscape today. We are pulling from modern archaeological records, these really fascinating recent genetic sequencing studies of the Icelandic population, geological surveys of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge.
Which is where Þingvellir sits.
Exactly. And of course, we're pulling from the great medieval texts themselves. We're diving into the sagas, specifically the really sprawling epics of Njáls saga and Egil's saga. Plus, we've got the Icelandinga or Book of Icelanders, which is essentially like their foundational mythology, and the Gragas, the Grey Goose laws.
The Grey Goose laws, right.
Yeah.
Your incredibly intricate legal code.
Yeah. So our mission here is to understand how this, what I kind of think of as the medieval equivalent of a Silicon Valley startup, tried to disrupt the very concept of European monarchy. Like they looked at the kings of the continent and just decided, hey, we can engineer something leaner and totally decentralized.
But to understand the mechanics of this, this startup, we really first have to examine the venture capital that funded it, which in this specific case was just pure desperation and displacement.
Yeah, nobody does this for fun.
Right. You do not simply load your family, your livestock, and every worldly possession you own onto an open wooden longship to sail into the terrifying void of the freezing North Atlantic, unless what you are leaving behind is far, far worse than the deadly unknown ahead of you.
The flight from tyranny. Let's look at the mythology versus the reality of this whole land taking, the landnam, because the traditional narrative, especially the one championed by Ari Thorkelsson in his 12th century Icelandic epic, it paints a really specific, super proud picture.
Oh, absolutely. The curated version.
Yeah, it's this story of noble Norwegian farmers and proud chieftains who are fleeing the oppressive taxes and the heavy-handed tyranny of King Harald Fairhair in the late 9th century. Harald was, aggressively centralizing power in Norway, bringing all these independent petty kingdoms under his singular fist.
And according to those texts, these freedom-loving elites, they just completely refused to bow. They chose exile over subjugation.
Right. The sagas frame it as this really noble exodus of the free, this aristocratic migration.
They do. And we actually have really detailed records from the sources of the early explorers who tested the waters before this main wave of settlement even happened. So there's a man named Nada Daughter who was essentially blown off course on his way to the Faroe Islands and just slammed into the eastern coast of this unknown landmass.
Just completely by accident.
Totally by accident.
Sure.
He hiked up a mountain, looked around, saw absolutely nothing but snow, and promptly named it Snowland. Which, that tells you everything you need to know about his first impression of the place.
Snowland is not a marketing campaign that's going to attract displaced nobility, right?
No, it certainly wasn't drawing in the crowds. And then following him was Geirjar, a Swedish explorer who actually took the time to circumnavigate the landmass, which proved it was an island. But the most famous early scout, and the one whose story really illustrates the brutal reality of this environment, was Floki Vilcher Ersson.
Ah, Raven Floki. Rafna Floki. He is such a fascinating figure in the sources. The story goes that he literally used 3 ravens to help him navigate across the ocean, right?
Yeah, releasing them one by one to see which way they flew to find land. A very pragmatic, if a bit grim, navigation tool.
So what happens when Floki actually gets there?
Well, when Floki finally arrived, he settled in for the winter. But the sources tell us the summer before that was so incredibly bountiful. I mean, the fjords were just teeming with fish, the shores were covered in seals and birds, that he and his crew basically spent all their time hunting and fishing.
They were just distracted by how good the summer was.
Exactly. They completely neglected a absolutely crucial survival mechanism, which was making hay for their livestock.
Oh no, they forgot that a North Atlantic winter was coming.
They did, and the consequences were just absolute. Over that first incredibly harsh winter, every single head of cattle he brought with him starved to death in the snow.
Oh, that's devastating.
It was a catastrophic failure. So in his bitterness and despair over losing his entire livelihood, Floki hikes up this mountain, looks down into a fjord that is completely choked with drift ice, and he just curses the place. He literally named it Iceland right then and there.
Just out of pure spite.
Pure spite. He packed up whatever he had left, sailed all the way back to Norway, and told absolutely anyone who would listen that the land was entirely worthless.
Though, to be fair to the island, the sources do note that one of his crewmen, a guy named Faxi, actually offered a dissenting opinion.
Yeah, Faxi liked it.
Right, he said it actually seemed like a pretty great place to live, which is why that massive bay facing modern-day Reykjavik is named Faxaflói today. But Floki's terrible branding stuck. The name Iceland became permanent. Yet, despite those apocalyptic warnings, people still came in droves, didn't they?
They really did. And that brings us to the man who is traditionally credited as the very first permanent settler, Ingólfur Arnarson. He arrives around 874 A.D., and his arrival is framed as this deeply cinematic, almost religious moment in the text.
Oh, the high seat pillars.
Yes. As his ship approached the rugged coastline, he took these carved wooden high seat pillars from his chieftain's chair back in Norway, which were, the literal symbols of his authority and his connection to the Old Norse gods.
Yeah.
And he just threw them overboard into the churning ocean.
He was basically outsourcing his urban planning to the gods.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. He vowed to build his permanent farm wherever those specific pillars washed ashore.
But the ocean is huge. Did they find them right away?
Not at all. The sources say it actually took his enslaved men a few years of literally just searching the coastline on foot to find them.
Wow.
Yeah, and they finally washed up in a bay where geothermal steam was constantly rising from the ground. So Ingólfur named it Smoky Bay.
Which in Icelandic is Reykjavik.
Exactly. Reykjavik.
Yes. The very city you, the listener, will be flying into. I mean, the airport you land at is surrounded by the very landscape Ingólfur claimed. But, okay, now, the sagas give us this incredibly proud, mythic origin of noble pioneers throwing pillars and claiming destiny. But I have to synthesize this with our modern sources, right?
Right, because there's a big discrepancy.
A massive one. Because the archaeological and genetic data paint a much darker, much more complicated picture of who was actually on those boats, don't they?
What's fascinating here is the stark contrast between the curated written history and the undeniable genetic reality. I mean, the 12th and 13th century saga writers, they desperately wanted their ancestors to look like pure, unadulterated Norwegian royalty, fighting for liberty.
Of course, it's PR.
Exactly, medieval PR. But modern DNA sequencing of the current Icelandic population, when traced back to the founding demographic, reveals a completely different story. The genetic data shows that while roughly 75% of the founding male population was of Norse descent, a staggering 62% of the founding female population was Gaelic.
Wait, 62%?
Yes, meaning they came from Ireland and Scotland.
That is a staggering statistical discrepancy. We are not looking at intact Norwegian families migrating together at all.
We are not even close. If we connect this genetic data to the broader geopolitical picture of the Viking Age, the mechanics of this settlement become horrifyingly clear. The Northmen who were leaving Scandinavia were stopping at their established raiding outposts in the British Isles, so places like Dublin or the Hebrides, on their way to Iceland.
Right, they were using them as pit stops.
Pit stops, yeah. And while there, they were kidnapping Gaelic women in massive numbers and forcing them across the ocean as enslaved wives, concubines, and domestic laborers.
So when we picture those iconic longships cutting through the waves toward the glaciers of Iceland, we cannot just picture a fleet of proud, happy families looking for political freedom.
No, absolutely not.
A massive portion of the human beings on those ships were enslaved women, ripped from their homes, being taken entirely against their will to a freezing, completely uninhabited rock in the middle of the ocean.
It's a very grim reality. The foundation of this society was deeply rooted in violence, coercion, and frankly, human trafficking. And to add another layer to the archaeological truth, the Norse weren't even the first ones there.
Oh, right, the monks.
Yeah, excavations have uncovered evidence of seasonal hunting cabins that predate the Norse arrival, and the written sources actually confirm that Irish monks, who were known as the Paper, had already discovered Iceland.
These were the hermit monks who were sailing into the most hostile environments imaginable just to find total isolation to get closer to God, right?
Precisely. They wanted to be alone. But when the violent, heavily armed pagan Norsemen arrived with their captives and their weapons, the Christian monks just abandoned their settlements and fled.
Can't really blame them.
Not at all. And the 13th century saga writers, they knew all of this, but they actively downplayed the Gaelic, the enslaved, and the prior Christian presence. They were constructing a foundational myth of aristocratic Norwegian freedom fighters to legitimize their own political power centuries later.
They didn't want their origin story to be a messy, mixed population of traumatized captives and brutal raiders.
Exactly. It didn't fit the narrative.
Well, listener, this is something you absolutely have to keep in mind as you drive your rental car out of Reykjavik and head toward the national park. You are tracing the literal footsteps of a deeply mixed, highly traumatized, and violent population. These were desperate people trying to survive a brutal, unforgiving landscape.
And they weren't just battling the cold, the volcanic soil and the isolation. They were battling each other.
Right, which brings us to this incredible pressure cooker of human desperation. It leads us directly to the core problem they had to solve to avoid total annihilation.
So by the year 930 AD, which is roughly 60 years after Ingolfur arrived, the island was essentially full.
Just 60 years.
Yeah, it filled up fast. The land noun, the period of taking land, was basically over. All the good arable valleys and the coastal plains had been claimed. So you now had tens of thousands of people, most of them heavily armed, steeped in a culture of really intense honor and blood vengeance, living in increasingly close proximity.
That is a demographic time bomb.
It really is.
Yeah.
And crucially, because they had come from all different regions of Scandinavia and the British Isles, everyone brought slightly different regional laws and customs.
So you have overlapping land claims, disputes over grazing rights for sheep, and absolutely no king to act as the ultimate judge.
Right. Without a centralized executive authority to settle these disputes, the society was rapidly degrading into pure chaos and bloody feuding. It was completely unsustainable. I mean, if a neighbor's sheep grazed on your land or someone insulted your brother and you couldn't agree on a local resolution, the only remaining recourse was violence.
They desperately needed a unified legal system.
They did. But they were ideologically terrified of creating a king, because escaping that centralized authority was the entire stated purpose of their migration in the first place.
So they essentially created a subscription service for governance, like they monetized and privatized political allegiance.
That's actually a really good way to describe it. They designed what anthropologists and historians call a stateless society, governed by the Godor system. And to understand how radical this was, we really have to look at the mechanics of medieval European power at the time.
Right. Set the baseline for us.
Well, at this time in Europe, a feudal lord ruled over a specific geographic area. His power was derived from the land itself. If you lived on his land, he was your lord. End of story.
But the Godor system inverted that entirely, right? Here's where it gets really interesting. Break down the mechanics of how this chieftaincy actually operated.
So they divided the political power of the island among 39 chieftains, called Goar, and the singular is Goi. The absolute genius of the Gogori system was that the office of the chieftaincy was not tied to geography at all. It was a fluid, abstract piece of private property. It was essentially a legal franchise.
Wait, let me make sure the listener really grasped the magnitude of this. The political office itself was private property. You could literally sell your seat in the government.
You could buy it, sell it, trade it, inherit it, or even split it into fractions and share it with someone else.
That is wild.
It is. And the most critical mechanism of this system involved the free farmers, who were called the Thingmen. Every free landowning farmer had to be attached to a Gogi, but they had the absolute right to choose which chieftain they wanted to pledge their allegiance to.
It was literally a free market of political allegiance. So if I'm a farmer living in a valley, my next-door neighbor might owe allegiance to a completely different chieftain than I do.
Exactly. Your political borders overlap in the exact same physical space.
So if my chieftain isn't protecting my legal interests at the regional courts, or, if he is demanding too much financial support, I can literally cancel my subscription. I can declare my allegiance to a rival chieftain across the river, transferring my political capital and my tax equivalent directly to his competitor.
It created an incredibly dynamic competitive market for governance. A chieftain only had power as long as he could attract and retain followers.
Right, he's got to earn it.
He really did. To maintain his market share, he had to be generous, he had to host feasts, he had to be a brilliant lawyer capable of defending his men at the assemblies, and he had to be physically capable of projecting force if a dispute turned violent.
It's almost like a negative feedback loop.
Yes, a remarkably sophisticated negative feedback loop designed specifically to prevent any one man from becoming a tyrant. The moment a deity became too oppressive, his followers would simply abandon him for someone else, rendering him completely powerless.
I mean, I have to challenge the stability of this, though. On paper, this sounds like a libertarian utopia, right? You have a free market of governance, no oppressive state taxation, and complete freedom of association. But the glaring, gaping hole in this system is the lack of an executive branch.
Oh, absolutely.
They had no police force, no standing army. They had these brilliant, intricate laws to decide who was right and who was wrong. But isn't this just a highly formalized recipe for vigilante justice?
It was. It was entirely reliant on privatized enforcement, which was ultimately the great vulnerability of the Commonwealth. The laws they created were breathtakingly intricate, but the enforcement was entirely DIY, do-it-yourself.
DIY justice.
Yeah. To manage the violence, they relied heavily on this concept of weregild, which translates to man price.
Man price, okay.
Basically, every injury, every insult, every stolen sheep, and every single death had a specific calculable financial value attached to it, usually measured in ounces of silver or lengths of homespun cloth.
Okay, let's run a hypothetical scenario so the listener can see this in action because this gets messy.
Yeah.
Say my neighbor and I get into an argument over property lines, and in the heat of the moment, I chop off his arm.
Ouch, okay.
Yeah, he survives, but he takes me to the regional court.
Right, so the court, which is presided over by the local chieftains, acting essentially as a jury, hears the complex legal arguments. And let's say they rule in favor of your neighbor. They declare that you, the attacker, owe him, say, 50 ounces of silver for the loss of the arm.
Okay, the gavel bangs. But there are no bailiffs in the courtroom. There is no police force to come to my farm, seize my assets, and physically give the silver to my neighbor.
Nope, none of that.
It is entirely up to the victim to enforce the ruling. So what happens if I'm a powerful guy with 30 heavily armed brothers and cousins hanging around my farm, and my neighbor is just a poor, isolated farmer? I mean, I'm just going to laugh in his face when he shows up asking for his 50 ounces of silver.
And that is exactly where the market mechanisms of the Godor system sort of compensated for the lack of police. If the poor farmer couldn't physically enforce his legal claim against you, the law allowed him to sell or transfer that claim to a more powerful entity, usually his chieftain.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The farmer might go to his go and say, look, I have a legal ruling for 50 ounces of silver against this man. If you go with your armed men and collect it, you can keep 40 ounces and just give me 10.
It is literally medieval debt collection through overwhelming force.
Precisely. It incentivized powerful men to uphold the law because they could actually profit from enforcing it.
But wait, what if you absolutely refuse to pay the chieftain? What if you just barricade yourself in your farm?
Well, a court had a final, devastating mechanism for that: outlawry.
The ultimate social exile.
Exactly. If a man was declared a full outlaw, he was stripped of all property and placed entirely outside the protection of the law. He could be killed by anyone, anywhere, with zero legal consequence.
Wait, really? Anyone could just kill him?
Anyone. In fact, killing an outlaw was often legally rewarded. It was a system that replaced state-sanctioned violence with heavily regulated, heavily litigated, privatized violence.
That is terrifying and fascinating. And all of this intense legal maneuvering, all of this chaotic, beautiful, terrifying system of DIY justice and political jockeying, it all culminated in one specific place. And listener, this is the place you're going to see. This is where your trip to Iceland intersects with the heart of this deep dive. You are going to Þingvellir.
The Assembly Plains, the literal and metaphorical center of the Icelandic Commonwealth.
Let's set the scene and trace the causality of how this place was even chosen. The year is 930 AD. The chieftains realize they desperately need a national assembly to standardize the laws and settle the biggest disputes.
Right. The local courts weren't enough anymore.
So a man named Grimur Gatsker is given this island-wide commission: scour the brutal topography of Iceland and find the absolute perfect spot for a parliament. He travels for months and eventually finds this sprawling, super dramatic, sunken valley. And in a twist of real dark pragmatism, it just so happened that the man who owned this prime piece of real estate had recently been convicted of murder.
Which is very convenient for the state.
Super convenient. So the nascent government simply confiscated the murderer's land and declared it public property for the assembly.
And it was an incredibly pragmatic choice geographically, too. It was situated centrally enough that it was accessible within 17 days of hard travel from even the most isolated eastern fjords.
17 days on horseback.
Yeah, the logistics of gathering a nation on horseback required a specific central hub. But honestly, the underlying geology of the site Grammar chose is what really elevates it from a mere meeting ground to one of the most spectacular historical sites on Earth.
Let's talk about that geological mechanics, like what the listener is actually walking on when they get there, because you aren't just walking on dirt, you are walking on a planetary seam.
You really are. When you step out onto the plains of Þingvellir, you are stepping directly into a massive rift valley situated squarely on the mid-Atlantic ridge. This is the exact visible seam where the North American tectonic plate and the Eurasian tectonic plate are ripping apart from one another.
You are literally walking through a geological divorce.
Exactly. Deep beneath the surface, magma is pushing up, forcing these massive continental plates away from each other at a rate of roughly 2.5 centimeters every single year.
Which doesn't sound like much, but over time...
Over millennia, it's massive. As the plates pull apart, the land between them literally collapses, sinking downward and creating this massive scarred valley filled with deep fissures, crystal clear glacial ravines, and these towering sheer cliffs of dark basalt rock.
There is such a profound, almost unbelievable poetry to this. The early Icelanders took a group of highly volatile, traumatized, fractured clans, and they tried to engineer a society focused on unity, law, and compromise. And they chose to build that society directly on top of a landscape that is quite literally tearing itself in half.
The physical tension of the Earth perfectly mirrors the social tension of the people standing on it.
It's the ultimate metaphor for the Commonwealth. But they didn't just choose it for the symbolism, did they? They actively weaponized this dramatic geology for political functionality.
They did.
Yes. Here's where it gets really interesting. The acoustic physics of this outdoor parliament. When you visit, listener, you will walk down a path through a massive gorge called the Almannagjá. It's a huge tectonic fault line, essentially a long corridor, flanked on one side by a sheer, imposing wall of dark, jagged volcanic rock.
And that massive rock wall serves a vital, intensely practical function. The Althing, the National Assembly, was presided over by a single elected official called the Lawspeaker. He would stand at a highly specific elevated location within the gorge called the Logberg, the Law Rock. And when he spoke to the crowds, that towering wall of basalt directly behind him acted as a massive natural acoustic amplifier.
That's brilliant.
It really is. It caught his voice and bounced it outward, projecting his words across the open plains so that the thousands of people gathered in the valley could clearly hear the proceedings.
It was nature's megaphone. And right below the law speaker at the Law Rock was the Lagretta, the Law Council. I really want you to visualize this when you stand there, listener. Imagine 144 men, the 39 chieftains, all their advisors, and the regional judges, sitting on simple wooden benches arranged in a circle, debating the laws of the land, negotiating settlements, and passing judgments under the vast, open, subarctic sky.
And you must visualize the sheer scale of the humanity gathered around them. The Althing convened for 2 weeks every single summer, right around the summer solstice in late June.
So it's basically daylight all the time.
Exactly. When the sun barely dips below the horizon and the sky is bathed in this perpetual twilight. For those 14 days, the desolate plains of Þingvellir transformed into the bustling, densely populated capital city of Iceland.
But it was a pop-up city. It was entirely temporary. I mean, they didn't build stone castles or huge halls. They built temporary booths called búðir, made of stacked turf and stone walls, and they would stretch massive woolen ship sails over the top of them to create roofs.
They essentially camped.
They did. The sources even detail how they engaged in literal landscape engineering just to support the crowds. They actually diverted the flow of a river to create the Uxarárfoss waterfall, sending fresh glacial drinking water cascading directly over the cliffs and onto the assembly grounds just to hydrate the thousands of people and horses camping there.
It was an incredible feat of environmental adaptation. And we must remember that the Althing was not just a grim, serious court of law. It was the absolute focal point of Icelandic culture. It was a massive 2-week festival.
It was the ultimate Viking networking event.
It really was. Merchants from Norway and Ireland came to sell timber, iron, and luxury goods. Families traveled from across the island to arrange advantageous marriages for their children. Brewers sold ale, beggars asked for alms, and storytellers and poets recited the histories of their ancestors.
But alongside all the trade and the law, there was entertainment and, well, reflecting the culture, much of it was deeply brutal.
I mean, heavily brutal.
I'm thinking of the horse fights. The sources frequently mention these events. They would literally take two massive aggressive stallions, pit them against each other in a ring, and the owners would stand right behind their horses, goading them on, beating them with sticks to make them fight harder.
A very chaotic scene.
Yeah, now imagine the demographics of this crowd. You have hundreds of heavily armed, hyper-competitive Viking chieftains and warriors, all hopped up on honor and regional pride, betting heavily on whose horse is superior.
It was an absolute powder keg. A slight disagreement over a fowl in a horse fight or a perceived insult from a rival owner would frequently escalate into drawn weapons.
Right there on the plains.
Right there. A man might be killed over a horse fight on Tuesday, and the resulting murder trial would be furiously debated at the Law Rock on Wednesday. The violence and the law were just inextricably linked.
Which brings us to the law itself and the absolutely unbelievable intellectual burden placed on the people running this system. Let's look at the Grágás, the Grey Goose Laws. This was the legal code of the Commonwealth, and its complexity rivals modern tax law.
It really does.
Mm-hmm.
What makes the Grágás truly astounding is that for the first 2 centuries of the Commonwealth's existence, the Icelanders did not have a written language.
Which is so hard to wrap your head around given how complex the laws were.
I know. They used runic carvings for short inscriptions, on stones or wood, but they did not have books or parchment. Therefore, the entire legal code, which covered absolutely everything from the precise penalties for murder and theft, to the intricate rules of inheritance, to the exact liability if you borrowed a neighbor's horse and it went lame, had to be preserved entirely through human memory.
That is staggering. The Lawspeaker, the guy projecting his voice off the basalt cliffs, was legally required to recite 1/3 of the nation's entire legal code from memory, out loud, every single summer.
Verbatim.
Over his 3-year term, he had to recite the entire law. If a dispute arose that wasn't covered in what he recited, he essentially had to search his mental database of precedents to rule on it. He was a living, breathing legal hard drive.
And this intense societal obsession with law, technicalities, and legal maneuvering is deeply reflected in their literature. The Icelandic sagas, which really serve as the living history and cultural memory of this period, are completely consumed by lawsuits and legal strategy.
Yeah, if you, the listener, haven't read the sagas, you might be picturing like Lord of the Rings. You might assume they're full of magical dragons, elves, and gods throwing lightning. But the Íslendingasögur, the sagas of Icelanders, are totally different.
Very grounded.
Super grounded. They read like gritty medieval westerns. They are set on the bleak edge of civilization, focusing on ordinary men and women trying to carve out a living in a harsh landscape where honor is literally more important than breathing.
Right. If we examine masterpieces like Njáls saga or Egil's saga, the central conflicts are rarely about saving the world from some grand evil. They're about mundane things that escalate catastrophically. They're about boundary disputes over a patch of forest, insults hurled at a feast, and the incredibly complex, protracted lawsuits that follow.
There's some wild, visceral concepts in these sources that show how different their morality was, too. Like Holmganga, formal duels to the death.
Oh, those are intense.
They would literally lay a cloak flat on the ground and the two men would fight on it. If you stepped off the cloak, you were legally declared a coward. Or consider their concept of vigilante execution.
Which sounds like an oxymoron.
It does. According to the law, if you killed a man in broad daylight, it wasn't necessarily considered murder, provided you rode to the nearest farm and openly announced, "I just killed this man, here is my name."
Right, taking public responsibility.
Yeah, it was considered a justifiable killing, open to legal compensation. But if you killed a man and tried to hide the body in the woods, that was classified as murder, an act of cowardice, and you were immediately declared an outlaw.
It all comes back to transparency, reputation, and honor. The society accepted violence as a tool, but it completely despised deception. However, the most pervasive, destructive theme in the sagas is the crushing, inescapable weight of the honor culture itself.
Right, and here is where I want to synthesize the mechanics we've discussed so far. We talked about Wergild, the ability to pay silver for a death. If the system allowed you to accept a financial payout for the death of your brother and everyone agreed on the price, why didn't it work?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why was the violence so unrelenting? Why couldn't they just take the silver and walk away in peace? Why did every single dispute constantly snowball into a multi-generational tragedy?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of their social structure, we can really understand the terrifying logic of the blood feud. In a stateless society without a police force, vengeance wasn't just a product of hot-headed anger. It was a strict, calculated societal duty.
A duty, not a choice.
Exactly. Your physical safety and the safety of your entire family depended entirely on your reputation for disproportionate retaliation. If someone insulted you or killed a member of your household and you just calmly accepted the silver payout and walked away, you were sending a disastrous signal to the rest of the island.
You were basically painting a giant target on your back that says, I'm weak, I won't fight back, come steal my land.
Exactly. Showing an ounce of weakness meant that you, your children, and your dependents would inevitably be victimized by predatory neighbors. To prevent future attacks, you had to strike back, and you often had to strike back harder just to reestablish a formidable, terrifying reputation.
The mechanics of this are laid out so tragically in Njáls saga. Let's walk the listener through the feud between Birgir and Holger because it perfectly illustrates how the system failed.
It's a perfect example.
So Njáls and Gunnar are best friends, two of the most respected men in Iceland. But their wives, Birgir and Holger, despise each other. And it starts over a really petty insult about seating arrangements at a feast.
A very minor slight regarding social status. But as we established, in an honor culture, status is survival.
Exactly. So while their husbands are away at the Althing, Holger orders one of her servants to go kill one of Birgir's slaves. Now, the husbands, Njál and Gunnar, they are desperate to keep the peace. They secretly exchange a purse of silver to pay the weregild for the dead slave, hoping to just squash it.
But the honor of the wives has not been satisfied. The public insult remains.
Right. The root cause isn't fixed. So the next year, Birgir orders one of her men to kill a slightly higher-ranking servant of Holger's. The husbands, again, desperately pass the silver back and forth to pay the legal fines. But it escapes their control. The retaliation escalates.
It always does.
They stop killing slaves and start killing free men. Then they start killing relatives. The weregild price keeps going up, the legal battles at the Althing become more vicious, until finally the entire system completely breaks down. It ends with a mob of men surrounding Njáls' farm in the dead of night and burning him, his wife Birgir, and their children alive inside their home.
It is a devastating critique of their own society. I mean, Njáls' saga shows a system where the logical, rational thing to do in every step, protecting your reputation and retaliating against aggression, leads inevitably to collective disaster. It was essentially a medieval arms race of honor, and everyone lost.
So, what does this all mean for the broader context of the Commonwealth? It means that despite the brilliance of the Godor system and the sort of democratic ideals of the Althing, the society was inherently fragile.
Extremely
It
fragile.
was basically eating itself from the inside. And you cannot maintain a fragile, isolated experiment in decentralized anarchy when the rest of the known world is rapidly consolidating into powerful, centralized, aggressively expansionist Christian monarchies.
No, you can't.
Which brings us to the existential threat of the year 1000 AD. Enter King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway.
Right, so the late 10th century saw a massive geopolitical shift. The kings in Norway were aggressively expanding their influence across the North Atlantic, and they were using the spread of Christianity as their primary political weapon.
Because a baptized nation was a compliant nation.
Exactly. King Olaf Tryggvason demanded that Iceland convert to Christianity and acknowledge his spiritual, and by extension, political, supremacy.
But the Icelanders were deeply, fundamentally resistant to this, and this wasn't just a debate over theology, was it?
No, not at all. I mean, yes, they worshiped the Old Norse pantheon, Odin, Thor, Freya, but more importantly, their entire political system was structurally tied to paganism.
Right. Explain that connection.
Well, the chieftains, the Goar, were also the pagan priests. They maintained the local temples and presided over the blood sacrifices. Their political legitimacy was derived directly from their religious role. To give up their religion was to voluntarily dismantle their own political authority.
King Olaf understood this perfectly, though, so he didn't rely on gentle persuasion. He engaged in brutal geopolitical extortion.
He really did.
According to the sources, he implemented a blockade. He closed Norwegian ports to all Icelandic trade ships. Now remember, Iceland is an isolated volcanic island. They relied heavily on that trade for essential survival goods like timber for building ships, grain for bread, and iron for tools and weapons. He essentially embargoed them to starve them out.
But he took it even further, crossing a massive line.
Oh, the hostages.
Yes. He took the sons of several prominent Icelandic chieftains, young men who just happened to be traveling or trading in Norway at the time, and he threw them in dungeons as hostages. He sent a message to Iceland explicitly threatening to execute their children if the nation didn't convert.
That is ruthless. And alongside the economic and physical threats, he sent missionaries. But these were not gentle monks preaching peace and love, were they?
No, he sent a German priest named Thangbrand. And Thangbrand was a militant zealot, essentially a religious thug. When he arrived in Iceland, his very aggressive preaching style immediately alienated the locals.
We can imagine.
And when some Icelandic poets did what Icelanders do best, which is, insulting, mocking, highly satirical poetry about Thangbrand and his foreign god, Thangbrand did not turn the other cheek.
No, he did not.
He literally hunted down the poets and murdered them in cold blood.
He assassinated his critics.
He did. He killed 2 or 3 prominent men before the Icelanders finally drove him out. He fled back to Norway and reported to King Olaf that the Icelanders were a wretched, stubborn people who were impossible to convert. And this report just infuriated Olaf, and he began preparing a military fleet for a full-scale, bloody invasion of the island.
So, listener, this brings us to the most dramatic, high-stakes moment in the history of Thingvellir. Picture the Althing in the summer of the year 999 or 1000 AD. The tension in the Rift Valley is just explosive.
Palpable.
The thousands of men gathered are armed to the teeth. The island is split right down the middle. On one side, you have the pagan faction who are furious about the trade blockade and the murders committed by Thangbrand, ready to fight to the death for their independence. On the other side, you have the newly converted Christian faction, terrified that the King of Norway is going to invade the island and execute their captive sons.
The situation reached an absolute breaking point. The 2 factions arrived at the Law Rock, and the Christians formally declared that they would no longer share the same law with the pagans.
Which is a huge deal.
Huge. They essentially seceded, declaring themselves a separate nation with their own legal code.
And we know what that means. If you have 2 different legal systems operating in the exact same geographical space, in a society that already relies on privatized violence and blood feuds, the system completely collapses. Total, catastrophic civil war is just hours away. The swords are drawn.
They were standing on the absolute precipice of destroying everything they had built over the last century. But in this moment of supreme crisis, an act of profound, almost unbelievable political pragmatism occurred.
I love this part.
The leaders of the Christian faction actually approached the Lawspeaker of the Althing, a man named Thorgeir Thorkelsson. Now, the crucial detail here is that Thorgeir was a pagan. He was a prominent pagan priest and chieftain from the north of Iceland.
Okay, so he's on the other side.
Right, but the Christians trusted his intellect. They approached him, handed him an arbitration fee of 3 marks of silver, and asked him to single-handedly decide the fate of the entire nation.
They paid the leader of the opposing religious faction to make the final call. I mean, the level of trust in the institution of the law over personal bias is just astounding.
It was a monumental gamble.
Yeah.
And Thorgeir accepted the massive burden of responsibility. The sources tell us that he retreated to his turf booth. He lay down on his bed, pulled a heavy fur blanket over his head, and lay there in absolute unbroken silence for a full day and a full night.
Well, thousands of armed men just waited outside, ready to slaughter each other, depending on what he said.
Exactly.
Let's unpack the psychology of that moment under the blanket, because the tension must have been suffocating. Was he actually having a deep spiritual vision, slipping into a trance to communicate with Odin and Thor to ask for guidance? Or was he just a brilliant, desperate politician, hiding from the noise of the crowd, sweating profusely in the dark, desperately running through every possible legal loophole, trying to engineer a compromise that would prevent his country from drowning in blood?
Well, the beauty of the text is that it leaves room for both interpretations. It was certainly a recognized pagan shamanic ritual to seek visionary insight by covering oneself.
Right, so it had precedent.
It did. But regardless of whether the process was mystical or purely analytical, the result was a masterpiece of calculated political genius. When Thorgeir finally pulled off the blanket and emerged from his booth, he walked up to the Law Rock, looked out at the divided nation, and delivered a ruling that saved Iceland.
He told the crowd that if they divided the law, they would divide the peace, and the society would inevitably tear itself apart. A house divided cannot stand.
Exactly.
So to ensure their survival and prevent a Norwegian invasion, Iceland must have one unified law and one religion. And that religion, he decreed, must be Christianity. Everyone on the island must immediately be baptized.
The pagan faction was absolutely stunned. Their own Lawspeaker had seemingly sold them out completely. But Thorgeir held up his hand. He wasn't finished.
Here's the genius part.
He immediately introduced a series of highly pragmatic, secret concessions designed specifically to appease the pagans. However, he said, while the public face of the nation would be Christian, pagans were legally permitted to continue worshiping the old gods in private as long as there were no witnesses to report them.
He literally invented the concept of religious privacy.
He did. And he went further. He decreed that the Icelanders could still legally eat horse meat.
Which was a big deal.
A massive deal. Eating horse was a vital, necessary source of protein for survival in the harsh winters, but it was also deeply associated with pagan sacrifices, and the Pope in Rome had explicitly banned it. Thorgeir basically ignored the Pope.
Just hand-waved it away.
Yep. And finally, he ruled that they could still practice the traditional custom of infant exposure.
Which means leaving unwanted or deformed infants out in the freezing elements to die. I know it is a horrific concept to modern ears, but in a subsistence economy that is constantly teetering on the edge of starvation, population control was seen as a grim necessity. The Catholic Church considered it outright murder.
So it was a breathtaking masterclass in political compromise. Thorgeir gave King Olaf of Norway exactly what he demanded on paper, a fully baptized, legally Christian nation which secured the release of the hostages and reopened those vital trade routes.
Right.
But he simultaneously allowed the Icelanders to maintain their crucial cultural traditions and their survival practices behind closed doors.
And miraculously, it worked. The tension broke. Civil war was averted. The pagan chieftains grumbled, obviously, but they accepted the ruling. The sources say they actually walked down to the geothermal hot springs near Þingvellir because the glacial rivers were too cold and they allowed themselves to be baptized in the warm water.
Very pragmatic to the very end.
Very. Though before we move on, I do want to do a quick bit of myth-busting for the listener regarding this event.
You're thinking of the Gofa's myth.
Yes, I am. Listener, if you travel up to the north of Iceland during your trip, you will likely visit a truly spectacular, sweeping waterfall called Gofa's, which translates to the waterfall of the gods. And tour guides and guidebooks absolutely love to tell the super dramatic story that after Thorgeir made his ruling at the Althing, he rode back to his farm in the north, gathered all his beautifully carved wooden pagan idols, and symbolically hurled them into the raging waters of this waterfall to prove his devotion to the new Christian god.
It is an incredibly cinematic story.
It's a great story, but our earliest, most reliable sources, specifically Ari's Icelandingabók, make absolutely zero mention of it, do they?
No, this story is actually a 19th century romantic fabrication. It was literally invented centuries later to add dramatic flair to the event. The historical reality was much more bureaucratic and quiet. Thorgeir just pragmatically accepted the new laws and went back to managing his farm.
Yeah, history is often less cinematic than the myths we layer over it. But Thorgeir's brilliant compromise successfully held the society together. However, by solving the immediate crisis and letting the institutional church into their stateless society, they accidentally imported a Trojan horse.
They really did.
They planted the seeds of their own total destruction.
Exactly. The introduction of Christianity fundamentally broke the economic engine of the Godora system. Initially, things seemed fine. But in the year 1097, almost a century after the conversion, the church introduced the tithe.
And this is where the entire medieval startup just collapses. Let's trace the mechanics of this collapse.
Okay, so the tithe was a mandatory 1% property tax levied on all landowners designed to support the church, the bishops, and the poor. Now remember how the chieftain system worked.
Right, the goor.
The goar, the powerful chieftains, were the ones who owned the most prime real estate. So when it came time to build physical churches, the chieftains built them on their own private land. Because they owned the land the churches sat on, they effectively controlled the church properties.
They basically became the administrators of the local parishes.
Precisely. And as the administrators, they were legally entitled to collect and keep a significant portion of the newly instituted tithe to maintain the church.
Wait, so they just took the money?
They pocketed a huge chunk of it.
Wow. So let's look at the socioeconomic mechanics of what just happened. You take a society where political power used to be fluid, based on shifting allegiances, reputation, and the ability to attract followers in a free market. And you suddenly inject a massive, guaranteed passive revenue stream into the pockets of a select few landowners.
It completely destroyed the competitive dynamic. The chieftains who owned church lands suddenly became unfathomably wealthy. They had massive amounts of liquid capital from the tithe. And what did they do with that capital?
Oh, I can guess.
They started buying up the other gorgers. Remember, the chieftaincies were private property. They started aggressively buying out their smaller competitors.
It's medieval corporate consolidation. Imagine being a poor farmer. You used to have a local chieftain you could talk to, someone who relied on your support to stay in power. Suddenly, his office is bought out by a mega chieftain who lives 3 valleys away, who doesn't care all about your local disputes, and who has a private army funded by church taxes.
And you can't do anything about it.
Right. You can't switch your allegiance because that mega chieftain now owns all the competing chieftaincies in your region, too. The free market is gone.
Over the next couple of centuries, that delicate balance of 39 fluid competitive chieftaincies was aggressively swallowed up. The wealth transfer was absolute. The sources detail how, by the early 13th century, all the political and legal power in Iceland had been consolidated into the hands of just 6 massive, ridiculously wealthy family clans.
The libertarian dream, this great experiment in decentralized governance, had just morphed into a ruthless, entrenched oligarchy.
Yes, families with names like the Hawkdaler, the Asburningar, and most notoriously, the Sturlungar.
And this era, the 13th century, is known to historians as the Sturlung era. It was an absolute bloodbath, wasn't it?
Total chaos.
These 6 mega-families, no longer constrained by the old laws or the threat of losing followers, waged a brutal, decades-long civil war against each other for total monopolistic control of the island. And here's what I want to ask. So what does this all mean for how we view the sources we've been discussing this whole time? Because there is a massive, bitter irony regarding the Icelandic sagas themselves.
Oh, the greatest irony is our perception of time when we read them. When modern readers pick up the sagas, these sweeping romantic epics of 10th century Vikings, full of rugged independence, noble duels, and strict honor codes, they assume they are reading ancient objective history.
Right, like a textbook from the past.
But these texts were actually being written down during the chaos of the 13th century Civil War.
They weren't history books at all. They were political propaganda.
Precisely. The incredibly powerful men leading these 6 warring families actively sponsored and commissioned the writing of the sagas. Let's look at Snorri Sturluson, who is one of the wealthiest, most ambitious, and honestly most deceitful men in Icelandic history, who is widely believed by scholars to be the author of Egil's saga.
Okay.
These oligarchs weaponized the past. They commissioned brilliant writers to craft stories about their specific ancestors from 300 years prior.
They were tweaking the historical borders, embellishing the heroics of their great-great-grandfathers just to prove a point in the present.
They used these romanticized tales of ancestral glory to legitimize their current violent power grabs. They were effectively saying, look at how noble my ancestor was in the saga. Therefore, I have the divine and historical right to rule this valley, even if I have to burn your farm to the ground to take it.
They were using the romanticized past as a cudgel to beat their opponents in the present. That is so cynical.
Very cynical.
But the violence of the Sturlung era escalated until it became completely unsustainable for the population. And the sources show us that it wasn't just the political violence, right? The environmental conditions were rapidly deteriorating as well.
Yeah, the climate was shifting, the medieval warm period was ending, and the climate was cooling significantly, making it much harder to grow hay. On top of that, massive volcanic eruptions were devastating the pastures, covering the grass in toxic ash.
So the sheep are dying.
The sheep are dying, the crops are failing. The ordinary farmers, the people who were caught in the crossfire of these 6 warring oligarchs, were starving, exhausted, and utterly desperate.
And the original system of DIY justice had completely collapsed. There was no impartial court you could go to if a Sturlung warlord with 200 men decided to steal your sheep or burn your farm. The law was just dead.
Dead. So, facing starvation and endless civil war, the Icelanders did the unthinkable. The descendants of the men who had bravely fled a tyrannical Norwegian king 350 years earlier finally threw their hands up in despair and actively begged a Norwegian king to step in and save them from themselves.
That is heartbreaking. Between the years 1262 and 1264, the Icelandic chieftains signed a treaty known as the Old Covenant. They officially pledged their fealty and submitted to the authority of King Håkon IV of Norway.
They gave it all up.
They agreed to pay him royal taxes, and in return, he promised to bring military peace, uphold a new set of royal laws, and ensure that regular trade ships arrived from Norway to prevent mass starvation.
The grand 300-year experiment of a stateless society was officially over. Driven by sheer exhaustion and institutional failure, they willingly handed the keys of their nation back to a monarch.
Wow. Let's just synthesize the magnitude of this journey. Listener, in just a few days, you are going to be there. When you step out of your car at Þingvellir and walk down into the shadow of the Almannagjá gorge, when you look up at those towering walls of dark volcanic rock, you really have to realize the layers of history beneath your boots.
It's so much more than geology.
Exactly. You aren't just walking in the geological space between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates.
You're walking through the physical remnants of one of the most intense, audacious social experiments in human history.
You are walking through the echoes of blood feuds that escalated until farms burned, of desperate compromises struck under fur blankets just to prevent civil war, of pagans quietly agreeing to be baptized in hot springs to save their children. You are standing on the very ground where a deeply traumatized people tried to engineer a fair, stateless society out of absolute nothingness, while the rock beneath them was literally erupting and tearing itself apart.
So when you finally reach the Logberg, when you stand right there at the edge of the Law Rock and look out over the sunken valley, I want you to ask yourself a profoundly difficult question.
I love this.
Did the Icelandic Commonwealth ultimately fail because it was fundamentally flawed, proving that human nature inevitably requires a strong, centralized ruler to prevent the rise of greedy oligarchs and endless war? Or is it a massive, soaring triumph of the human spirit that a society built by violent raiders and abducted captives managed to survive, adapt, and peacefully govern themselves for over 3 centuries on a freezing rock at the edge of the known world, using nothing but the power of the spoken word and the willingness to compromise?
That is the immense weight of the question you get to ponder as you look out over those plains. We really wish you a profound, awe-inspiring, and truly unforgettable deep dive into the landscape and the history of Iceland. Keep asking the hard questions, keep looking past the tourist myths to the incredibly complex reality underneath, and keep exploring. Until next time.